She came into this world at the very end of the Roaring Twenties, in the vast country that was rushing into a new era, full of promises and threats alike. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was born on September 13, 1923, in the rural village of Osino-Gai of the Tambov region, into the family of schoolteachers. Books, strict discipline, and the belief in the necessity of serving others became the natural heir of her childhood. Her father, Anatoly Kosmodemyansky, was a teacher of literature and a man whose health was broken too early by imprisonment in Stalin's purges, an unspoken shadow that fell on the family. Her mother, Lyubov Timofeevna, strong and resilient, pulled the family forward, raising two children, Zoya and her younger brother Alexander. Later he would become a tank officer and hero of the Soviet Union. But no one yet knew how many stars of tragic greatness the war would bring the Kosmodemyansky family. When the family moved near Moscow, first to the settlement of Borisovo, later to the working suburb of Golyokovo, Zoya grew into a serious, stubborn girl. She loved reading more than anything. Gorky, Pushkin, Jack London, and especially stories that placed a person face to face with hardship and moral choice. She admired heroes, not the ones who boasted of their deeds, but the quiet ones, ready to give themselves without hesitation. Her classmates remembered her as proud, even harsh. If someone acted unfairly, Zoya could explode in anger. A bully once teased a younger student. Zoya grabbed a dictionary and struck him on the head so fiercely that everyone froze. Her teachers wrote, "She does not tolerate lies." She seemed to already measure life by moral categories that many adults were afraid to invoke. The war found her at 17. The voice of Molotov on the radio, the breathless pause in which millions realized everything had changed. All her private concerns, school exams, dreams of a future profession, instantly lost any meaning. Zoya wrote in her notebook, "Now there is only one road." In the first months of the invasion, her enthusiasm clashed with the reality of Moscow's evacuation and harsh military regulations. She tried 3 times to volunteer, and 3 times she was rejected as too young. The humiliation burned inside. As her classmates were sent to dig trenches and build barricades, she had to wait. Patience was not something she possessed. In October 1941, the German army approached the outskirts of Moscow. The capital was blacked out. Trenches crossed the woods of the Moscow region. Anti-tank hedgehogs rose across highways. Air raid sirens wailed at night, and thousands of civilians hurriedly evacuated eastward. Yet many others, especially youth, moved in the opposite direction, toward the front. Zoya finally got her chance. One day in her school, a Red Army officer appeared and quietly announced, "Volunteers are needed. Not everyone will be taken. The work will be difficult, dangerous. Who is ready?" Zoya was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Thus, in late October, she joined a secret military detachment, the 4th section of the Special Purpose Unit, Oznazi, under the NKVD. It was located not far from Moscow, in the village of Golitsino. Recruits were not told details, only that the fate of the capital might depend on them. There she trained intensively. Clandestine movement, use of incendiary mixtures, silent communication, reading terrain at night. Most importantly, the ability to disappear into the forest like a shadow. Though she struggled with physical tasks, she was slight and suffered occasional migraines. She never asked for rest. She clenched her teeth and continued. Her instructors noticed a fire in her eyes, not recklessness, but a stubborn and unbreakable inner decision. She wrote to her mother only once. "Don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing." War was no longer a distant storm. It was here, in every frosted breath, every train packed with soldiers, every headline about burned villages. and Zoya now felt exactly where she had to be. On the narrow, dangerous road she had chosen herself, the road into the occupied zone. Soon she would learn her first code name. Soon she would step into a world where every whisper could cost a life. Soon her name would be spoken by millions, and her fate sealed forever. The frost came early that year. By mid-November 1941, the forests west of Moscow were white and silent, the air so sharp it cut the lungs. Somewhere beyond those woods, German patrols were already building fires near the frozen villages of the Moscow region. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was one of the 20 young agents preparing to move behind enemy lines. Their orders were short and cold as steel. Disrupt the rear. Burn everything that can shelter the Germans. They were told little else. The mission was led by Lieutenant Boris Krenov, calm, grey-eyed, the kind of officer who had seen more than he said. He gathered the volunteers in a hut and looked them over. "You are all here by choice," he said quietly. "Remember, no one will come for you if you are caught. There will be no rescue. You'll have to rely on yourselves and your comrades." Then he added, "This isn't just war, it's the defense of Moscow." Zoya stood at attention among them, wrapped in a soldier's coat several sizes too big. The fur collar brushed her chin. Her eyes, however, were steady. The commander noticed and gave a small nod. Before dawn, they crossed the front near the village of Petrishchevo. The night was clear. Snow creaked underfoot. Somewhere far behind, the artillery thundered, but here only the frozen river murmured under thin ice. They carried bottles of incendiary fluid, grenades, and small pistols, though they all knew the pistols were more for self-inflicted shots than defense. Capture meant torture. Their task was brutal in its simplicity: destroy barns, stables, and any buildings occupied by German troops. Deprive them of warmth and shelter, make the winter itself a weapon. The Red Army was gathering strength for the counter-offensive, and every degree of frost was to become an ally. In the first days, the detachment moved through the woods, setting fire to empty huts, cutting telephone lines, ambushing isolated soldiers. Zoya worked tirelessly, carrying bottles, standing sentry, watching the horizon. Her comrades later recalled, "She spoke little, but she always volunteered first." By the third night, the frost became unbearable. Zoya's boots cracked, her scarf froze stiff. Hunger gnawed at everyone. They slept in haylofts, too exhausted to keep watch. That was when things went wrong. On November 27th, near Petrishchevo, they tried to burn a stable full of German horses, but the alarm went up too soon. Shots rang out. The team scattered. Zoya stayed behind to cover their retreat, setting the last building on fire. Flames leapt into the night, a bright, reckless signal. When she tried to leave the village, she found herself surrounded. A local woman, frightened or perhaps desperate for favour, had betrayed her. German soldiers dragged her from the snow, her coat half burned, her hair matted with frost. They searched her pockets: matches, a small axe, a notebook with coded entries. The officer in charge, Captain Ruder, struck her across the face. "Spy," he demanded in broken Russian. Zoya looked at him and said nothing. "Saboteur? Who sent you?" She only smiled faintly, blood on her lips. "You'll never know." They locked her in a shed, tied her hands behind her back, and left her standing through the night. The temperature dropped below -20. A German guard later admitted she barely shivered. By morning they brought her before the local commander for interrogation. They beat her, stripped her boots, and demanded the names of her comrades. Zoya, 17 years old, refused to speak. When the translator repeated the question, she replied clearly, "You can't make me talk. There are hundreds like me behind you. You'll hang us, and others will come." For 2 days they tortured her. Villagers heard her cries from the barn, but also her voice, sometimes singing, sometimes reciting verses. One witness recalled, she kept saying something about freedom, about Moscow. She wasn't afraid. On November 29th, the Germans decided to make an example of her. They built a gallows on the central street of Petrishchevo, right by the telegraph pole. The villagers were ordered to gather. Snow fell in heavy flakes. Zoya was led out, barefoot, her face bruised but calm. A soldier placed a placard on her chest. Arsonist of houses. The officer read the sentence in German, then Russian. Zoya stood straight and said loudly so everyone could hear, "You hang me now, but you cannot hang the whole Soviet people. I am not afraid to pass away. The others will avenge me." Her words spread like wind through the terrified crowd. Some German soldiers shifted uneasily. One muttered, "Mädchen mit Streichhölzern," the girl with the matches. A few moments later, the rope tightened. The body swayed and the crowd lowered their heads. But someone whispered. She smiled. That winter, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya became more than a person. She became a symbol, though at that moment she was only a frozen girl in a village burned by war. Her comrades who escaped later reached Soviet lines and reported her capture. The message went up the chain of command, eventually reaching Moscow. For a while, no one believed it. Then a journalist from Pravda arrived in the region after its liberation and saw the gallows still standing in the snow. The name of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya would soon thunder across the entire Soviet Union. But that belonged to another act, when memory and myth would intertwine. When the Red Army liberated Petrishchevo in January 1942, the village was a black skeleton of charred wood. Snow covered the ashes. Near the square by the telegraph pole stood a crude gallows, the rope still frozen, swaying in the wind. The soldiers stopped, silent. Someone said quietly, "This must be where they hanged her." They found a local woman who whispered through her scarf, "Yes, the girl. She said her name was Tanya." In her pocket, when captured, Zoya had no documents, only her code name. Tanya. For weeks she was known to her captors and to her comrades only by that name, faceless and nameless. It was Lieutenant Kranov, the commander of her sabotage group, who later confirmed her true identity. When he finally reached Soviet headquarters, frostbitten and exhausted, he reported, Tanya was Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. The report went up to the headquarters of the Western Front. There, among the piles of daily dispatches, artillery movements, logistics, losses, it caught someone's attention. The details were unusual. A young woman, 17, executed by the Germans for sabotage, refused to speak under torture, passed away with courage. That was when the story began to grow, not just as a report, but as a symbol. The Pravda article. In mid-January 1942, Pravda correspondent Pyotr Lidov travelled to the liberated region to verify the account. He found the villagers of Petrishchevo still shaken. Some pointed to the remains of burned houses, others wept silently. Lidov listened and took notes. A peasant woman told him, "She was so young. She said she wasn't afraid." He found the gallows and a half-erased sign still lying nearby. Arsonist. He wrote in his notebook, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a schoolgirl from Moscow, executed by the Germans, who defied them to the end. A few days later, Pravda published his article under the headline, Tanya. Her real name is Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. The effect was immediate and electric. Across the country, people read the story aloud in barracks, in factories, in schools. Soldiers copied her words into notebooks. You cannot hang all of us. Mothers in distant villages whispered her name as if it were a prayer. For a nation fighting on the brink of destruction, Zoya became the living embodiment of resistance. The idea that even in defeat, there was honor, even in death, victory. The official recognition. In February 1942, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet awarded Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, posthumously. Her mother, Lyubov Timofeevna, received the Gold Star and the Order of Lenin. The ceremony was brief, dignified, and unbearably silent. When she accepted the medal, she said quietly, "My daughter was not special. There were thousands like her. She just happened to be caught." Her words were reprinted across newspapers, but few grasped their weight. By then, Zoya was no longer a person. She was a myth the country needed. The making of a symbol. Posters appeared, Zoya's face, recreated from school photographs, gazing out with calm defiance. Her last words were printed beneath, "I am not afraid to die for my people." Artists painted her as a saint-like figure, haloed by winter light. Poems were written, songs composed. In schools, children were told about the girl who set fire to the enemy's stables and smiled before the gallows. The regime embraced her image, turning it into a moral weapon. She became the girl with the matches, Devushka so spichkami, a symbol of the burning will of the people. The simplicity of her act, the purity of her sacrifice, became a rallying cry for those freezing in trenches and for those forging steel far behind the front. But in the quiet corners of Moscow, her family lived the other side of that legend. Her younger brother Alexander also joined the army and would pass away later in the war. Her mother walked the streets of the capital, always dignified, always carrying herself like a woman who had given more than anyone should be asked to give. At times she received letters, thousands of them, from strangers, soldiers thanking her, mothers sending blessings, children asking if Zoya really smiled before she passed away. Lyubov Timofeevna answered some of them, writing simply, "Yes," she smiled. The war continues. Meanwhile, the war ground on. The Germans were forced back from Moscow, the tide beginning to turn. Soviet soldiers shouted, "For Zoya!" as they charged. The name echoed in frozen air, a banner invisible but powerful. For them, she was the sister they never met, the comrade they would avenge. And yet, among those who had known her, her classmates, her commanders, the legend felt both sacred and unbearable. They remembered her laughter, her awkwardness, the way she tied her scarf. To them, she was still human. Not an icon, but a girl who believed fiercely in something larger than herself. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was gone, but her story had only just begun to live. By 1943, Zoya's name had spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In Allied newspapers, she was called the girl who defied the Nazis, the Soviet Jeanne d'Arc. Her portrait appeared in British magazines, in French underground pamphlets, even in American military bulletins. But inside the Soviet Union, her story took on a life of its own, one carefully shaped by both admiration and politics. The party understood the power of her image. Zoya became the centerpiece of wartime propaganda, her courage used to inspire, to unify, to embody the ideal Soviet citizen. The sacred image. In schools, teachers told her story as a moral lesson. Children recited her words as though they were scripture. "You cannot hang all of us." In cities, streets and factories were named after her. Statues appeared in parks, a slender girl with wind-blown hair, her gaze fixed on an invisible horizon. The girl with the matches became a saint of the homeland, a martyr whose flame burned not barns, but fear itself. Her school in Moscow, number 201, was renamed in her honor. A museum room was created, a small space filled with her notebooks, her letters, and a pair of mittens she had knitted before the war. Visitors wept. For many, Zoya was proof that the human spirit could rise above brutality. The investigations. Yet, behind the legend, quiet questions began to stir. After the liberation of the Smolensk region and parts of Belarus, Soviet counterintelligence units began collecting testimonies about partisan actions. Reports surfaced suggesting that the mission in Petryshevo might not have been as straightforward as the papers described. Some commanders wondered whether the villagers' hostility had been misjudged or whether the arson operations had endangered civilians. The NKVD files on the mission remained sealed, marked top secret. But none of this diminished Zoya's heroism in the public eye. The truth of her courage was unquestionable, even if the full story, with all its pain and complexity, was less clear. Her mother's burden. For Lyubov Timofeevna, the years after her daughter's death were a quiet torment. She attended commemorations, gave speeches, met with soldiers and students. Her face became familiar in newspapers, yet every appearance cost her deeply. She once told a journalist, "I do not want pity. I want people to remember her as she was, alive." At home, she kept Zoya's photographs on a small table by the window. On the back of one, she had written, "My little girl who became everyone's daughter." When the war ended, she visited Petryshevo. The villagers met her with tears. The gallows was gone, replaced by a stone monument. She placed flowers there and stood in silence for a long time. Some said she whispered, "Now you can rest." The brother's fate. Zoya's younger brother Alexander had grown up in her shadow, proud, determined to be worthy of her memory. He entered the Red Army as a tankman, fought in East Prussia, and was killed in 1945, just weeks before the end of the war. When news reached their mother, she did not cry in public. At the funeral, she said only, "Now they are together." To many, the Kosmodemyansky family came to symbolize the ultimate Soviet sacrifice, a family that had given both children for the motherland. The story, both tragic and majestic, became part of the country's moral foundation. Between memory and propaganda, in the decades that followed, Zoya's image appeared everywhere, in textbooks, films, and paintings. The 1944 movie Zoya, directed by Lev Arnstam, turned her into a cinematic legend. Her words, as written by screenwriters, echoed across generations. "If I must die, let it be for others to live." For some, she was a heroine beyond reproach. For others, a symbol shaped too perfectly, too politically. But in the hearts of millions, she remained something more intimate. A girl who believed in justice, who did what she thought was right, and who paid the ultimate price. In the late 1950s, Soviet historians began cautiously revisiting archival material. Some discrepancies appeared, small details of dates, reports, and orders. But none of them touched the essence of her act. Whether every element was precise or embellished no longer mattered. The truth of her bravery, her refusal to break, was undeniable. The enduring flame. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, students brought flowers to her monument in Moscow. Veterans stood beside them, saluting. Even those born long after the war felt the weight of her name. In classrooms, teachers still spoke of her as the embodiment of moral strength, not merely as a political symbol, but as a human being who chose conscience over fear. In time, Zoya's face became timeless, not belonging to one era or one ideology, but to the eternal question: what does it mean to be brave? Time passed, and the echo of war faded into textbooks and memorial days. Yet Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya's story did not vanish into silence. It lived on, retold, reinterpreted, sometimes reshaped, but never forgotten. Her flame still flickered, refusing to pass away. The Soviet legacy. In the post-war decades, Zoya's name became part of the Soviet national identity. Children grew up learning her story alongside those of Alexander Matrosov and the defenders of Brest Fortress. She was the symbol of self-sacrifice, of youthful purity bound to the ideals of the motherland. Her portrait hung in schools, pioneer palaces, and military academies. The inscription beneath was always the same. She gave her life so that others might live. In 1942, she was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. It was the highest possible honor, yet even that could not encompass the emotional weight of her sacrifice. To many, Zoya was not just a hero, she was a moral compass. Her name was given to collective farms, ships, streets, and even a small planet discovered by Soviet astronomers in 1978. In Moscow, a solemn statue of her figure stood against the wind, coat fluttering, face calm and fearless. On Victory Day, veterans placed carnations at its base in silence. The myth and the doubt. But as decades passed, new generations began to ask questions. Historians in the 1980s and 1990s re-examined the archives, comparing testimonies and wartime orders. They discovered contradictions, minor but intriguing. Had Zoya truly acted alone in Petrishchevo? Were the villagers guilty or merely terrified peasants caught between two armies? For some, these revelations weakened the myth. For others, they strengthened the truth behind it. Because what mattered was not the precise detail of each command, but the unyielding courage that lay beneath. Zoya was not a saint carved from stone. She was a girl, frightened, cold, but determined to do what she believed was right. Her humanity, not perfection, was what made her immortal. The eternal return. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many of its symbols faded. Monuments were dismantled, names changed, ideals rewritten. Yet Zoya's story endured. In schools, her tale was still told, sometimes without ideology, sometimes with renewed reverence. In the 2000s, filmmakers and historians returned to her legacy. Documentaries used original photographs, intelligence files, and testimonies from surviving witnesses. The truth that emerged was complex, full of light and shadow, like the very war it came from. At exhibitions in Moscow and Rzhev, visitors could see her real belongings: a woolen scarf, a small notebook, the fragment of a burned matchbox found near Petrishchevo. They stood as quiet relics of a brief life that changed millions. A girl beyond time. What made Zoya's story endure so powerfully? Perhaps it was because she represented something that transcended politics. The moment when an ordinary person faces an impossible choice and says no to fear. Writers called her a flame that does not burn but enlightens. Teachers spoke of her not as a myth, but as a measure of conscience. And in the hearts of those who still visited her monument, Zoya remained neither propaganda nor legend. She was a reminder that courage could exist even in the darkest winter. Each year, on November 29th, people still gather in Petrishchevo. Schoolchildren come with flowers and candles. Veterans, few now, stand beside them in silence. The snow falls softly on the memorial stone that marks the place where she died. And when the candles flicker, it feels as though the past breathes again, not with grief, but with pride. The lasting meaning. More than 8 decades after her death, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya's story continues to live. In history books, in art, in whispered classroom readings. For Russians and for the world, she remains a symbol of how conviction can overcome cruelty. She never lived to see victory, never saw the German army retreat or Moscow saved. Yet her sacrifice was part of that salvation, a spark in the great storm of resistance. And so, her flame burns still, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Because sometimes, as history teaches, One small match can light the fire of a nation.